Hello, this is Gabrielle Pullen with an introduction to the Feldenkrais method of awareness through movement, affectionately known as ATM. And the application we'll be discussing here is how awareness through movement can help with recovery from trauma, loss, and grief. The fact is that severe trauma or bereavement demands a new relationship to the environment, because it's as if the earth underneath you has been moved in a massive earthquake. So obviously there must be a reorganization of how you stand. If the footing of your very life has been displaced, then there's an adjustment that's necessary. And when all that you hold dear has been brought into question by the enormity of your loss, you must find some new equilibrium. Awareness through movement deals concretely with developing skill and adapting to your environment, come what may. And we think that we're separate from our environment, but we are not as independent of the environment as we imagine. For example, neurologist Antonio Damasio puts it this way: the entire construction of knowledge, from simple to complex, from nonverbal imagetic to verbal literary, depends on the ability to map what happens over time inside our organism, around our organism, to and with our organism, one thing followed by another thing, causing another thing, endlessly. In other words, how we respond to our environment affects how we feel, for better or worse, affecting our primary environment, the most important environment you will ever have, which is your internal experience of life. Trauma makes a big dent in how we experience life, and by extension, our environment. So it's an obvious place to start affecting change for the better, because awareness through movement is a direct link to affecting greater comfort in that area. And if we are to recover that elusive sense of equilibrium. In the many aftershocks of a loss that relate to death, personally, I find myself recurrently wondering and wandering from whatever's in front of me, sort of dazed by the difference between the living and the dead. And I wonder, where did she go? What's separating me from her now that she's dead? I eat, I sleep. Those are the needs I balked at in the beginning. Almost as if I, on some level, hoped that by starving myself I could disband the apparent illusion of separation. But as the shock wears off, further along, I notice that I have interests and habits that anchor me to this world in ways that have deep roots, preventing me from completely losing touch with that thing that people call reality. I've often thought that it would be much easier if I could lose a marble or two, but to no avail. So if I'm to be here, I might as well make the most of it. Otherwise, staying stuck in grief is simply pure agony. And few things have power to pull me out of it, but one thing is a curiosity and finding a thread of what used to interest me. And finding the thread of your own curiosity is a major player in the work of Moshe Feldenkrais, who developed the method. And so for me, the specific curiosity is, can a somatic approach move me more efficiently, more quickly out of this fairly recent state of loss? And my experience is yes. My research and training also provide clear justification for the idea. And the more I go back and look at the literature on trauma and recovery and somatics, which I've studied before I was in this situation myself, the more obvious the correlations become. What's different here is that I'm experiencing it from the inside, seeing and knowing what's going on as it happens. Moshe Feldenkrais was known for pointing out the most obvious difference between the living and the dead, and that is that we move. And if someone does not move for a prolonged period of time, they are pronounced dead. And at the end, even on death's door, there is often movement, a soft rising and falling of the chest or the belly. And at the beginning, every new mother knows that tightening of anxiety in the belly that accompanies the search for evidence that the ever so slight movement that signifies so much, that signifies life, is visible when she goes to check her sleeping baby. But this act of moving is far more complex than movement or no movement. Some of the functions of the body occur without conscious direction. The muscles of the heart act to regulate the flow of blood. The muscles of the skeleton act to incite motion. They're also integral in generating the pumping action that allows blood to flow up and down along the length of the arms and legs and standing against the pull of gravity. All this spontaneous maintenance is performed by the nervous system, without which the body would not be able to stand, even with a fully formed skeleton possessed of normal musculature. And before it became fashionable to talk about the mind-body connection, Moshe had already pointed out that there is no separation between mind and body. The whole idea is preposterous, because if you had a body, because that body would fall without a brain to coordinate its standing, and without a mind to direct it to stand, to sit, or a brain to allow it to learn how to walk. Otherwise, we'd all be bedridden. The brain and the mind are an inseparable part of the body, a system that works within to regulate the inner and outer workings, to create the context of our relationship with the environment. So where's the room for separation? In anatomy, they say form follows function. It's true. If you could make a robot that had muscles, a skeleton, and a brain, you would still be at ground zero. What would that robot know about how to speak? Not only that, but what language would it speak? English? French? German? Russian? Japanese? Would it be able to do calculations in trigonometry? Could it play chess or the ancient board game of Go? Could it play musical scales? And if so, would it play scales in the manner of China, or the way they do it in India, or how we do it here in the West? Of course not. All that is wired in from birth is the internal function, those functions of the autonomic nervous system that keep us alive. Everything else is slowly learned from birth to the age of, say, 20 or so, as the brain develops its full size and full capacity. And it's a very precise sequence that, when varied, is often evidence of abnormal growth. A baby is born without the ability to make sense of vision until the brain wires in the ability to control the muscles of the eye, to respond appropriately to the stimulus of light and dark. And that takes a few days. The spinal coordination of lifting the head in space must precede sitting. So there's a sequence of events that happens in the learning that we need to actually interact with the world. And if that doesn't happen, then we might as well be a paraplegic. And over all those years of that sequence of events happening, an integral way that that happens is that we learn by responding to the environment. Therefore, we need the environment as much or more than it needs us. Something to think about when we take the world that we live in so for granted. But what's most telling in terms of the importance of environment upon the identity of the individual is that a baby born into the world with a fully functional brain is fit only to do what an animal can do. It can only organize internal necessities like digestion, excretion, blood pressure. It's actually animals that, in many cases, surpass humans in functionality when they're born. A foal, for example, will attempt to stand within minutes of birth and staggers off within the next few minutes. But even in that instance, it's the continual stimulus of the mother's tongue licking mucus off the foal's body that serves to help the foal's brain identify itself, its beginning, where it ends, and to feel its own shape, the location of its muscles, the sensation of moving. So it's a feedback loop. So where I'm born will dictate the language that I speak. Again, environment is key. It's going to dictate what notions I hold about the hidden connotations of words or behavior or body language, as well as what's considered acceptable or not acceptable in terms of behavior. Since the bulk of early behavior by default is encouraged by approval and therefore externally motivated. So much of our learning is wired in by circumstance that the bulk of it occurs by external motivation and also by chance, not by choice. And therein lies excessive room for error. If things happen by chance, it's a crapshoot. Do you do it because it works, or because that's the way you've seen it done, or that's the way it's always been done? Or that's just not even something you question in your mind because you've never seen anything else. And what you've absorbed by osmosis that doesn't work for you in the way you think and in the way you carry yourself in space may not even ever come to the fore unless you engage in a process such as we do in Awareness Through Movement, where we actually take time in a quiet space, in a relaxed, attentive environment to look at what works and what doesn't, and how we want to be, and do we actually know what we're doing. And by the same token, trauma occurs as an accident of fate, not by choice. It's an accident of fate that confounds all previous learning, all dearly held assumptions about self and other in the universe. ATM is uniquely placed to provide assistance with reconnecting to the environment in new ways that help make a felt sense of what a person can build on now that everything is not the way it was. It's a huge body of work that provides a clear means to improve how we learn so that it can be a self-directed process that is much more consciously related to choice and talent. It's not a healing modality. Healing may happen, but it's a side benefit. It's a learning modality that's especially valuable in rewiring the sensate impressions, the psychosomatic tensions, and the desecrated sense of one's own safety and competence that's the natural legacy of severe loss. So most approaches operate from a healing model, but the implication there is that you're broken. And what's broken is the old way of relating to reality, not you. And when you work to improve your ability to make sense of the basic stimulus of everyday life, which is what your brain does, that's its function, that's its purpose. But it's just that we're bringing awareness to that process to see if it's doing it in a way that works, or if it's doing it in a way that was perhaps older or somehow got stuck because of the trauma. ATM allows you to ground yourself in a process that's very familiar, because we've all learned how to walk in a way that's very similar to the environment created in Awareness Through Movement. You meet again on the ground with what is constant in spite of all the chaos. Things like gravity. And you may not know consciously how to do this, but your brain does. And because the process of learning how to navigate your environment has been self-directed from the beginning, This is a natural way to proceed. Children don't take walking lessons. On the other hand, adults are so set in their ways of thinking, noticing and perceiving, that they're much less aware than children of what works and what doesn't. ATM provides a clear path for improving how you do what you do, and empowering you to test your experience with many small variations, first in one direction, then in another, so that you can compare from your own point of view what works with what doesn't. It offers a new set of values that are completely necessary for survival after trauma. Can you be compassionate with yourself? As you start to play with the first lessons of awareness through movement, you may notice that you actually move in ways that are very abrupt and insensitive and disrespectful to yourself. Other important things that you really develop a fine skill at sensing are: when have you had enough? And can you honor that? Will you actually stop when you're done? And what's the difference between when you should rest and when you really do need to push on, even though you don't feel like it? That's a pretty fine line, but one that's key. Because if you do nothing, then you're moving into depression, moving into not moving, moving in the direction of death. So the question is, how can we reclaim life? And to go back over the process that we go over as we're learning to live, as we're growing and maturing, accesses the ability to sense things in your body so clearly that you can tell what's good for you and what's not, so that you don't just do what somebody else's idea is about what's good for you. Because that's another phenomenon, is that you'll have people telling you what they think you should do, and maybe because you don't know what to do, you'll do whatever, and that doesn't work either. That's going to lead you down a lot of dead ends. So can you learn how to sense what's right for you? And this is empowering. And one of the things that Moshe was always ready to explain was that the truth of human development is that there is no empirical right way. There's only what's right for you. And he would often say that if you don't know what you're doing, you can't possibly do what you want. And so learning how to really get a sense of what you're doing and is it working is really an important step in the right direction. And if loss is eating away at you, chances are you have a profound sense that you don't know what you're doing anymore or why. So I invite you to experience a new possibility. What if you could find a way to systematically move into a new way of relating to yourself and to the environment, guided by a new set of values? Would it help you to rewire your brain to continuously look for what's most comfortable, for example? Or to find ways to do more with less effort? Would you be interested in learning how to use your environment, to use gravity to your advantage? Would it actually help to regularly practice being more compassionate with yourself in this situation, less judgmental? If you're already encompassed by pain, finding your own internal compass involves learning to sense yourself more clearly, so you can respond spontaneously instead of reacting unconsciously, because there are layers upon layers of stuff, unprocessed emotions, experiences, memories, thoughts to deal with. Any stressful event can cause a significant regression to older, safer habit patterns. In the case of emotional stress, it may be an older way of thinking about life, a recurrence of old anxiety, for example. And this must be addressed for any improvement in quality of life to occur. It's not a static thing. It can change. But thought doesn't happen in a vacuum, and thoughts that evoke chronic emotional pain have physical consequences. Any simple one-celled organism will retract from an electrical stimulus. And in a similar way, our bodies may adapt to chronic pain by retracting from space in some way. And it's a way that's usually invisible to the untrained eye, but that is actually one of the areas of specialization of the Feldenkrais practitioner. The sensory motor system is designed to guard us from danger, and it doesn't distinguish between real or perceived threats or events. And it doesn't distinguish between the present or the past. Its protective function, called the trauma reflex, happens below the level of conscious awareness, so you won't even know that you're doing it. You may be aware of being more tired or having less energy or feeling stiff. That's about it. And it may entail a habitual holding of the breath or an ingrained somatic pattern of almost as if cringing ever so slightly with the whole self, as if warding off pain, or just like someone who's flinching from being burnt by a lit cigarette. Or you might hear people talk about someone whose posture seems like they're carrying the weight of the world. Different people respond in different ways, so it's going to look different in different people, but usually there will be some evidence of that after significant loss. The bottom line is that when loss intervenes to create a situation wherein your relationship to your own body has become a negative association, you got to do something about it. Because it seems like you sense it as, it feels like a difficult place to be, and yet it's your primary environment, and so it needs to be addressed. Ultimately, your internal environment is the most important one you will ever inhabit, no matter where you live, in what part of the world, city or country. And ATM is an introduction to a way to fundamentally rewire that. The fundamental threads that run through any lesson that can help you create this new response. This response that's about finding what works, that's about learning to be more compassionate with yourself, that's about learning to release tension that's held within the nervous system below the level of conscious awareness.